How old are you? How much time has passed since your beginning? It's an important question we measure with something constant. We count the Earth's orbits around the sun. Now, how many times have you seen the stock market reach all-time highs? In 2021, the S&P 500 did this 70 times. My friends just had a baby. The last time the S&P 500 peaked was in January. She has only known the correction. How old will she be when it's over? After every market bubble, you find a chart that looks like this, but then zoom out, and suddenly it's just a blip. How far will we have to zoom out next time? The FTSE 100 in London reached its peak in 2018. The royal children of Meghan and Prince Harry are both still zero when measuring in all-time highs. Time in the market is more important than timing the market. Every once in a while, you hear stories like this. Ronald Read, a janitor, dies and leaves $8 million to a library. Grace Groner, a secretary, dies and leaves $7 million to Lake Forest College. Do not be fooled. These are not stories about investments. These are stories about time. Ronald was 92 and Grace was 100. If they had died at 80, their donations would have been like a tree falling in the forest. Stocks only go up is a battle cry that's both absurd and true. Or it had better be. The entire edifice of the financial industry is built upon the idea that you'll be fine if you just keep a long-term view. What would it take to break this narrative? How big would the bubble have to be? What would it look like from the inside? How old are you? Do you remember this sound? Maybe someone told you once about the Nikkei, but maybe not. The Japanese stock index hit 38,916 on December 29, 1989. No matter how far out you zoom, the bubble doesn't go away. The easiest place to start is in 1985 with the Plaza Accord. Prior to that, Japan had been increasingly successful in its manufacturing. This was a problem for the United States, which at the time still had a largely manufacturing-based economy because not only were they facing stiff competition on quality, but in relative terms, their goods were more expensive due to the strong US dollar. The Plaza Accord was an agreement between Japan, Germany, the UK, France, and the US aimed at weakening the US dollar so that they could continue to export their goods worldwide. In Japan, this meant a sharp increase in the value of the yen, strengthening the entire Japanese consumer base all at once. However, this may have been overdone as suddenly Japan's exports began to fall. To try and solve this problem, Japan slashed its interest rates. Suddenly, Japanese citizens had strong currency and the ability to borrow it at low prices. Money began flowing into assets. A cycle started where people got loans to buy land, secured additional loans with that land, and then used those funds to buy stocks and even more land. Land prices in Tokyo were so high that allegedly the property comprising the greater Tokyo area was worth more than all the property in the United States. A new and popular use for property was golf courses. There was a boom in construction, and then a bubble within a bubble formed in memberships to each course's private clubs, which could be bought and resold like any other investment. The price for joining the most exclusive clubs in the US currently is $250,000 and then $32,000 annually. In Japan in the late 80s, prices were several million. The government estimated that the market value of all golf course memberships in 1991 was more than 5% of Japan's gross national product. Stock took off as well, of course. Prices were up multiples in just a few years, and this is where the best story from Japan's bubble era comes from. There was a restaurant in Osaka owned by a woman named Nui Anue. It featured a large statue of a toad, and that toad gave stock tips. And these tips were extremely good. It started in 1997 when Anue received a commandment from God, always an extremely promising signal about financial acumen, that told her it was time to begin investing. To get started, she needed capital, so she went out and committed just enough fraud to make her wisdom worthwhile, posting fake collateral and receiving 4 billion yen in return, around $30 million. From there, though, she went legit. Well, maybe. There's rumors about Yakuza and insider trading too, but one thing that's for certain is that the investment she made went up. Way up. And people outside of the spirit realm started to notice. Bankers and stockbrokers from the top companies in Tokyo sought her advice, arriving on the bullet train from Tokyo in time for a midnight vigil. First, they would all pat the head of the toad. Then they would recite prayers in front of Buddhist statues in Anue's garden. And finally, Anue would sit down in front of the toad and go into a trance until it had delivered its message of which stocks to buy and sell. By applying this method, Anue came to control over $10 billion in assets, making her the largest individual investor in Japan and nearly the world. From the mouth of the toad, Anue would say, comes money. Eventually, the Bank of Japan ended the party by raising interest rates. Land prices and the Nikkei came crashing back to earth. Anue sought to double down to preserve her empire and went back to her original fraud of generating fake assets to be used as real collateral, this time receiving loans for hundreds of billions of yen. But as the market continued to fall, she was eventually found out. Her bankruptcy proceeding involved the largest debt in the history of Japan, and despite her lawyer arguing that she held no responsibility as she had absolutely no knowledge of stocks and was being manipulated by her surroundings, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison for her fraud. It may seem self-evident that you shouldn't be taking financial advice from a restaurant owner who's taking advice from a ceramic toad, but narratives can be tricky. Anue was unable to pay back about $2 billion worth of loans that she'd fraudulently acquired. A disaster until you consider that the loans themselves totaled over $20 billion. The toad, it seems, had prevailed. While the Nikkei lost over 50% in the next few years, Anue's drawdown was merely 10. In 1991, Jeanne Clement became the oldest person in history. Then, she just kept going. What's the record for the longest anyone has ever lived, you could have asked during that period? I don't know, would have been the answer. How old is Jeanne Clement today? The record grew with every passing second. Clement remains the only 120, 121, and 122-year-old in the history of the human species, despite dying over 20 years ago, an all-time high in longevity. This is frustrating. Why? In 1972, Eugene Cernan stepped back into the lunar module, making him the last man to walk on the moon. There were 12 in total. Eugene and 7 of the others are gone. How long before there are none? We expect things to move forward with time, because if they don't, what are we even doing here? Kane Tanaka died last month. She was the oldest person in the world and made it to second on the all-time list. Her replacement is 118. In late 2021, The Nikkei fought its way back to over 30,000, but has since fallen 10%. NASA said they'd put a man back on the moon by 2024. They're not saying that anymore. It's like time is standing still. Nui Anue's death in 2014 was so unheralded that Wikipedia doesn't seem to know whether it really happened. How old was she? 84, maybe. She never saw another all-time high, at least. It's okay, though. Someone will. No one lives forever, but neither does anything else. Zoom out. My friend's baby will be 122 in the year 2144. She will live on Mars. The news will mention something about the markets back on Earth. She doesn't know it, but she just turned 1. Thanks for watching, guys.